So, Trump just had a big summit with Xi Jinping, and he's calling it a 12 out of 10 meeting. Apparently, everything went perfectly. They've agreed to pause China's export restrictions on rare earths, reduce some tariffs, and open the door to more chip exports. And if you just read the headlines, you'd think this was some huge diplomatic breakthrough. But when I actually sat down and read through some of the details, it did not necessarily feel like a major win for the US. It felt like a delay, a face-saving pause, like the US is still playing catch-up and China kind of knows it. And what really stood out to me is what's happening at the same time in Canada. While all this drama is unfolding, the photo ops, the bold claims, you know it, Mark Carney is quietly meeting with Xi too, but it's a very different energy because there is no grandstanding, no frantic backtracking, just diplomacy, calm, focused, grown-up diplomacy, a la Carney. And honestly, the more I compare the two approaches, the more I genuinely feel like Canada is the only one in the room actually playing for the future. So today we're going to talk about what was actually agreed at the Trump-Xi summit, not just the headlines, but the deeper meaning behind this so-called deal. We'll break down what it means when China suspends rare earth controls, why that matters for the US supply chain, and what the long-term risks still are. Then we're going to look at how Canada is handling that exact same moment, how Mark Carney's approach compares, what's on the table in Canada's China talks, and why, honestly, I think Canada is coming out of this looking a lot more stable, a lot more credible, and a lot more future-focused. Before we get into it all, though, I just want to say a huge thank you to Garda Lee for the incredibly generous shout-out in his recent video. If you're one of the many new viewers coming from his channel, welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. House of L is where we have clean debates about what's going on. Not everything is about Canada, but a lot of it is. And I'll always welcome your views. An important principle of House of L is that we treat disagreement as an invitation for discussion and not an attack. So I really hope that you feel welcome in this community as well. I've admired Garda Lee for a very long time. He is very clear, independent, and unafraid to say the quiet parts out loud, which we desperately need more of right now. And if you haven't come across his channel yet, I really recommend checking it out, especially if you care about Canada, trade, media distortion, or just plain common sense. He's definitely one to watch. So check him out, let him know Elle says hi, and enjoy the sheer brilliance of well-researched patriotic content. But before you get too sick of creators fawning over each other, let's dive in. So here's the scene. Donald Trump and Xi Jinping met in Busan, South Korea, and the headlines lit up immediately. Trump called it a 12 out of 10 meeting because it was just that good. He said everything was amazing. Rare earths resolved, tariffs cut, supply chains secured. But when you dig into the details, the actual wins for the US look far thinner. Here are the main points just for context. China agreed to pause its newly announced export controls on rare earths for 1 year. The US in return said that it would reduce certain tariffs, specifically the fentanyl-related tariff on Chinese imports from 20% to 10%. In effect, Trump said that he would slash the aggregate tariff level on Chinese goods from 57% to 47%. That is lower, but let's be honest, that's still a super high number. On rare earths and critical minerals, because this is a huge topic as you all know, China still holds the control levers. They're just not pulling them for now. The export licensing regime remains. The power remains with China. Also, Taiwan wasn't even brought up, according to Trump. So while major strategic issues remain untouched, the optics get updated. In plain English for everyone, the US walked away with a calm for a year, but not much in the way of durable structural change. China walked away with its leverage intact and time to move quietly. But now let's shift the lens to Canada, because while the US is doing the dramatic summit photo op thing, Canada is repositioning itself, and honestly, I like those odds a lot more. So here's the scene. Carney is on his first major trip to Asia under his premiership. His mission is to reduce Canada's overwhelming dependence on the US, diversify trade, forge new alliances. We've discussed this on the channel before. He will meet with China's Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit in South Korea. What I'm seeing here is there is no fanfare, no loud sweeping claims, just a decisive pivot. Canada is not bragging about winning, which seems to be the strategy of other parties. It's stepping into the game for the long haul. Let's discuss why this matters. Carney himself said it. Canada aims to double its non-US exports over the next decade. He recognized that relying on a single partner, the US, now makes Canada very vulnerable. On the China front, Canada is not naive. Carney acknowledged that China doesn't share all Canadian values when it comes to trade, yet he also recognized that we must be very careful, very deliberate in re-engaging this. There is another video on this. Check it out if you want. More importantly, the message from China is aiming to repair ties. From Beijing's side, the official line is that China-Canada relations have shown a recovery towards a trend of positive development. Now, this tells us Canada is not chasing headlines, but rather just building capacity. While the US seems to be relieved at a one-year truce, Canada is asking, well, what happens after that 1 year? Where are the supply chains? What are the deep industrial partnerships? What do the next 10, 20 years look like? Now, that is real foresight in my view. Carney's approach appeals here because it's strategic rather than reactive. Canada is not just pandering to one partner, it's opening new doors while still keeping its values in mind. And when a large global power like China says, let's reset, Canada's in the room, not just on the fringes. Quick word, by the way, if you find this kind of analysis valuable, there are two ways to support this channel. I've got a book on critical thinking coming up this weekend. Link is in the description. If you sign up, I'll send you a discount when it drops. And if books aren't your thing, but you still want to keep this kind of work going, there's a Ko-fi link down there as well. Every bit helps. Now, it's very important to note here that China helpfully publishes 5-year development plans which define their top priorities for the future, 5-year period. China's 15th 5-year plan, that would be covering 2026 to 2030, is being framed as a critical stretch of time, a key period, to move towards full modernization by 2035. So this is a huge deal. What caught my eye here is the language. China is not simply upgrading its industries, but rather setting emerging frontier technologies as core strategic priorities. We're talking about quantum technology, biomanufacturing, hydrogen energy, nuclear fusion, 6G communications and advanced AI networks, deepening its industrial systems from basic research to technological breakthroughs to industrial transformation is the phrasing that I saw. Now, what does all of this tell us, especially from a Canadian vantage point? Well, I think that it tells us that China is not improvising. Rather, it has planned it out for all of the future decades, and people should be paying attention to this. This is built around self-reliance. China is making its own chips, its own rare earths, or at least controlling the supply chain, and dominating next-gen tech. The pause we just saw in rare earths control, to me, it looks like a strategic move, not necessarily a concession. China is essentially holding off, choosing not to act now, while still retaining the lever. And from Canada's perspective, this is an important moment that while the US is caught up playing a short game, we've paused the tariffs, we've suspended the export controls, Canada now has the opportunity to watch this long game, align itself properly, choose its partners smartly, and build from a place of trust and credibility. Because here's what the data suggests. A country that plans this far ahead demands your respect, even if you don't yet admit it. When China says quantum fusion hydrogen, it's not a buzzword list, my friends. It's a roadmap for them. And in Canada, well, it's important to keep this in mind instead of look back 10 years later and then just going like, how do we miss that again? So Trump says that this was a 12 out of 10 meeting, but behind the scenes, the US just took down tariffs because she promised to try harder on fentanyl exports. This was not a negotiation between equals, in my view. This was one side asking for a breather and the other side granting it on their terms with all the leverage still intact. And here's what really bothered me here. The US still doesn't have an industrial policy with any real teeth. There's no long-term investment plan, no deep infrastructure play, no vision for how to secure the supply chains that power modern economies. Rare earths are still mostly processed in China. Battery metals, same story. Even in 2025, after all the speeches and reshoring rhetoric, the US still doesn't have a domestic supply chain that can operate independently, and certainly not at scale. And it's not just about the minerals. The US also lacks strategic alignment at this point. Allies are watching this, the EU, Japan, Canada. And what they're seeing is a kind of volatility. Deals were made, then turn up, partnerships were floated, then forgotten. It's hard to build durable economic security when the political environment shifts with every election cycle, or every week at this point. And what we're seeing is the fallout in real time. Canadian National just laid off 400 managers, citing reduced freight volumes linked to the trade war. That is not abstract. We've discussed this before. These are real people, real businesses already feeling the ripple effects of a tit-for-tat tariff game that has no long-term winner. And even within the US, the Senate just voted to effectively reject Trump's tariffs, a rare bipartisan moment that tells me there is growing recognition that this is just not sustainable. So yeah, to me, this was not a win. It was a timeout wrapped in a press release. And here's the contrast that matters. Canada did not need to blink, because it wasn't staring anyone down to begin with. Canada is not playing the performance game, it's playing the endurance game. So while Trump is trying to stage manage a short-term victory, Carney is laying down foundations methodically and strategically. And that's exactly the kind of leadership that will matter 10 years from now, not who got the best headline in Busan. So when I take a step back and look at all of this, the trade pauses, the summit spin, the long-term plans unfolding behind closed doors, I can't help but feel like we're watching two entirely different games being played here. One is loud, reactive, and built for the cameras and the headlines and the YouTube videos, the drama. The other is steady, long-term, and honestly a little harder to notice until the results show up a decade later. Canada is not trying to outshout anyone right now. Canada is just laying the groundwork, rebuilding trust, diversifying its partners, keeping its strategic interests aligned with its values. That doesn't always make for a flashy headline or the dramatic rage bait, but it does make for a future I actually want to be a part of. And I guess the real question I'm left with is this: when we look back 10 years from now, who will have actually built something that lasts? Let me know what you think in the comments. I'd love to hear your take on it. And if you want more content like this, feel free to subscribe and check out the book link in the description. Until next time, stay sharp, stay curious, and as always, stay nuanced.